In a French café in the heart of Manhattan, where expensive suits and arrogant glances filled the air, a single father in worn jeans stood in line with his little girl. Behind him, a wealthy woman began speaking in French, her voice dripping with contempt. She called him pathetic. She said his daughter deserved better than a father who clearly could not afford to be there. She believed he would not understand a single word. But when the man turned around and opened his mouth, the entire room fell silent. What had he just said? Le Maison d'Or sat on Madison Avenue like a jewel that only the wealthy could afford to admire. The cafe had been there for over 30 years, serving croissants and café ode to Manhattan's elite. Its walls were painted in soft cream and gold, with velvet chairs the color of Bordeaux wine arranged around marble tables. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the Sunday morning crowd. The menu was written entirely in French, and a single cup of coffee cost more than some people's hourly wage. This was a place where people came not just to eat, but to be seen. On this October morning, the air outside carried the first chill of autumn. Leaves had begun to turn orange and red along the streets, and New Yorkers were pulling out their lighter jackets. Inside the cafe, however, everything remained perfectly controlled. The temperature was just right, the music was soft, French jazz, and the staff moved with practiced elegance. Every customer looked like they belonged on the cover of a magazine. Designer handbags rested on tables. Gold watches caught the light. Conversations were held in measured tones, as if being too loud would shatter the illusion of refinement. Marcus Thompson stood at the entrance with his daughter's hand in his. He was 38 years old with tired eyes and calloused hands that told the story of hard work. His flannel shirt was faded from too many washes, and his jeans had long since lost their original color. His sneakers were worn at the heels, the kind of shoes a man wears when he cannot justify spending money on new ones. He looked nothing like the other customers in this cafe. He knew it the moment he walked in. Several heads turned in his direction, eyes scanning him from head to toe before quickly looking away. He pretended not to notice. Beside him stood Lily, 6 years old, with her mother's brown eyes and a small dimple on her left cheek. She wore a floral dress with tiny yellow flowers on white cotton, a dress her mother had bought for her 3rd birthday. It was slightly too small now, but Lily refused to wear anything else on special days. Today was a special day. Today marked 2 years since her mother had died, and Lily had asked to wear the dress so Mommy could see her from heaven. Marcus had not argued. He had simply helped her button the back and told her she looked beautiful. The cafe held memories from Marcus that he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He and Emily had discovered this place during their first year of dating, back when he was still a graduate student at Columbia, and she was finishing her degree in art history. They would come here on Sunday mornings, sharing a single croissant, because that was all they could afford, speaking French to each other just for the fun of it. Emily had always laughed at his accent, even though his French was technically perfect. She said he sounded like a professor, even when he was ordering pastry. She was right. He had become a professor, and for 5 years he had taught at the Sorbonne in Paris, while she painted watercolors of the Seine. Those had been the happiest years of his life. Everything changed when Emily got sick. The diagnosis came suddenly, and the decline was faster than any of them had expected. Within 18 months, she was gone, leaving Marcus alone with a 4-year-old daughter, and a grief so heavy he could barely stand. He had resigned from his position at Columbia, unable to focus on lectures about French linguistics when his world had collapsed. For the past 2 years, he had worked as a freelance carpenter, building furniture and fixing things for people who could afford the repairs. The money was modest, but it allowed him to be home when Lily needed him. That was all that mattered. Now, before Emily died, she had made Marcus promise one thing. She wanted him to take Lily to La Maison d'Or on a special day and order her the best croissant in the house. Emily had always said the croissants there tasted like Paris, and she wanted her daughter to experience that magic at least once. Marcus had held her hand and promised he would. Now, 2 years later, he was finally keeping that promise. The glass door swung open behind Marcus, and a wave of expensive perfume filled the air. Victoria Ashford entered the cafe like she owned it, which in some ways she almost did. She was 45 years old, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored Chanel coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her handbag was a Hermes Birkin in classic black, and her heels were red-soled Louis Vuitton that clicked against the marble floor with every step. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, and diamonds sparkled at her ears. She was the kind of woman who expected the world to make way for her, and it usually did. David Miller, the cafe manager, spotted her immediately and rushed over with a wide smile. He was 30 years old, ambitious, and knew exactly which customers deserved special treatment. Victoria Ashford was at the top of that list. She owned a chain of high-end art galleries across Manhattan and was known for hosting parties where a single glass of champagne cost $200. She came to La Maison Dorée every Sunday, always sitting at the same table by the window, always ordering the same thing in flawless French. The staff treated her like royalty because she tipped like royalty and complained like a queen when things were not to her satisfaction. David greeted her with a slight bow, speaking in French as she preferred. He apologized that her usual table was occupied and explained that the cafe was unusually busy this morning. Victoria waved her hand dismissively and said she would wait. But as she took her place in line, her eyes landed on the man standing in front of her, and her expression shifted from mild annoyance to visible disgust. She looked at Marcus's worn flannel shirt, his faded jeans, his old sneakers. She looked at the little girl beside him in a dress that was clearly too small. Her lip curled slightly, the way one might react to finding something unpleasant on the bottom of an expensive shoe. Victoria was not the kind of woman who stood in lines behind people like this. She was not the kind of woman who waited for anything. The sight of this obviously poor man, bringing his child into a place where he clearly did not belong, offended her sense of order. In her world, there were places for people like her, and places for people like him. And this cafe was definitely not meant for the latter. She shifted her weight impatiently, her heels clicking against the floor as she checked her gold watch and sighed loudly enough for everyone around her to hear. Lily tugged at her father's hand and pointed at the glass display case filled with pastries. Her eyes were wide with wonder as she looked at the golden croissants, the chocolate clays, and the delicate fruit tarts arranged like works of art. She asked her father in her small, clear voice, which one Mommy would have liked best. Marcus knelt down beside her and pointed to the plain croissant at the top of the display. He told her that Mommy always said the simple ones were the best because you could taste the butter and the love that went into making them. Lily nodded seriously, as if this was the most important information she had ever received. Behind them, Victoria had heard enough. She turned to a well-dressed couple standing nearby and began speaking in French, her voice just loud enough to carry. She said it was pathetic, really, watching a man who obviously could not afford to be here pretending he belonged. She commented on his clothes, his shoes, the way he knelt on the floor like a servant. She said the child's dress looked like it came from a thrift store, which was probably true. The couple exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. A few other customers nearby heard her words, and some of them smirked. Others simply looked away, not wanting to get involved. Marcus heard every word. His French was flawless, perfected over years of study and 5 years of living in Paris. He understood the contempt in her voice, the casual cruelty of her observations. His jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on his daughter. He would not make a scene. Not here. Not today. This day was about Emily's promise, not about defending himself against a stranger's judgment. He stood up slowly and took Lily's hand again, moving forward in the line as the customer ahead of them finished ordering. Victoria was not finished. She continued speaking in French, emboldened by the lack of response. She said the man probably could not even read the menu, that he would embarrass himself trying to order. She wondered aloud why the cafe did not have some kind of dress code to prevent this sort of situation. Then she said something that made Marcus's blood run cold. She looked directly at Lily and said in French that it was sad, really, how some children were cursed with fathers who could not provide for them. She said the poor little girl would grow up knowing she was never good enough, because her father had never been good enough either. Marcus's hand tightened around Lily's. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, anger rising like a tide. He was struggling to hold back, but he kept his face calm. He would not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing him react. He had survived worse than cruel words from a stranger. He had held his wife's hand as she took her last breath. He had explained to a 4-year-old why mommy was never coming home. He could handle this. Lily looked up at her father with confusion in her eyes. She could not understand French, but she understood tone. She understood that the woman behind them was saying something mean, and she understood that it was about them. Her lower lip trembled slightly as she tugged at her father's sleeve and asked why that lady kept talking about them. She asked if they had done something wrong. She asked if they should leave. Marcus looked down at his daughter, and in that moment, his heart broke a little more. He saw Emily in her eyes, in the worried furrow of her small brow. He had promised Emily he would protect their daughter, that he would teach her to be strong and kind and proud of who she was. How could he do that if he let some stranger make her feel ashamed? How could he teach her about dignity if he stood here and accepted humiliation in silence? He faced a choice that felt impossible. He could stay quiet, avoid confrontation, and get through this morning without incident. He could buy the croissant, find a table in the corner, and pretend none of this had happened. That would be the safe choice, the easy choice. Or he could speak up, defend himself and his daughter, and risk making things worse. He could risk being asked to leave, causing a scene that would upset Lily even more. He could risk proving this woman right, that he did not belong here. Marcus took a deep breath and squeezed Lily's hand. He told her quietly that they had done nothing wrong, that some people just forgot how to be kind. He told her to wait right here while Daddy talked to the lady for just a moment. Lily nodded, trusting him completely, the way only a child can trust a parent. Marcus straightened his shoulders and turned around slowly to face Victoria Ashford. The entire café seemed to hold its breath. Marcus turned to face Victoria, and for a moment their eyes met. She looked at him with the kind of dismissive arrogance that came from years of never being challenged. Her perfectly manicured eyebrow arched slightly, as if she was surprised he had the audacity to look at her directly. Around them, the café had grown quieter. Conversations at nearby tables had stopped mid-sentence. Customers were watching now, some openly, others pretending to study their menus while stealing glances at the unfolding scene. The air felt thick with anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. David Miller noticed the tension immediately and began moving toward them. His face wore an expression of professional concern, but his eyes kept darting to Victoria. She was a valuable customer, the kind who could make or break a restaurant's reputation with a single review. He could not afford to let her feel uncomfortable. As he approached, he positioned himself slightly closer to Marcus, his body language making it clear whose side he was on. He asked if there was a problem, but the question was directed at Victoria, not Marcus. His tone suggested he was ready to solve whatever issue she might have, even if that issue was the presence of a man in worn clothing. Victoria smiled at David, a cold smile that did not reach her eyes. She told him in English, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that there was no problem yet. She simply found it curious that the café did not seem to have standards anymore. She gestured vaguely at Marcus without looking at him, as if he was an object rather than a person. Several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in pearls whispered something to her husband. A young man in a tailored suit smirked and looked away. No one spoke up. No one defended Marcus. The silence was its own kind of verdict. Lily pressed closer to her father's leg, her small fingers gripping the fabric of his jeans. She could feel the hostility in the room, even if she did not fully understand it. Her eyes were wide and worried, darting between her father and the tall woman with the cold smile. She asked Marcus in a whisper if they were in trouble. She asked if the lady was angry at them. Marcus reached down and stroked her hair gently, telling her everything was fine. But his voice was tight, and Lily was old enough to know when adults were not telling the whole truth. Victoria watched this exchange with undisguised contempt. She turned to a woman standing nearby and spoke again in French, confident that Marcus could not understand. She said it was almost amusing, watching him try to comfort his child when he was clearly the source of her distress. She said men like him should know their place and stay there instead of dragging their children into situations that only highlighted their inadequacy. She finished by saying that his silence proved her point. He did not understand a word she was saying. He was exactly what she thought he was. Nothing more than a poor man pretending to be something he was not. Marcus had heard enough. He had stood in silence while this woman mocked his clothes, his appearance, his ability to provide for his daughter. He had held his tongue when she suggested Lily deserved a better father. But something in her last words, the absolute certainty that he was inferior, that he did not even possess the intelligence to understand her insults, broke through his carefully maintained control. He thought of Emily. Hilder thought of all the Sunday mornings they had spent in this very café, laughing and talking in French because it was their secret language. He thought of the promise he had made to her, and he knew that keeping silent was no longer an option. He looked directly at Victoria and began to speak. His French was flawless, each word pronounced with the precision of someone who had spent years mastering the language. His accent was pure Parisian, the kind that could only be acquired through years of immersion. He told her that he understood every word she had said from the moment she first opened her mouth. He told her that her grammar was correct and her vocabulary was adequate, but her humanity was severely lacking. He spoke calmly without raising his voice, but every word carried weight. The café had gone completely silent now. Even the soft French jazz seemed to fade into the background. Victoria's face went pale. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She had not expected this. She had built her entire attack on the assumption that this man was exactly what he appeared to be, a poor, uneducated father who could not possibly understand the sophisticated language she used to demean him. Now that assumption had crumbled, and she was left standing in the wreckage of her own arrogance. The customers who had smirked at her earlier comments were now looking at her differently. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Marcus continued speaking, still in French. He told her that he had brought his daughter here today to fulfill a promise he made to his late wife. He told her that this café held precious memories for his family, memories that had nothing to do with money or status or the brand of one's handbag. He said that a person's worth was not measured by the clothes they wore or the size of their bank account, but by how they treated others, especially those they perceived as beneath them. He finished by saying that by that measure, despite all her obvious wealth, she was the poorest person in this room. Lily tugged at her father's sleeve, not understanding the words, but recognizing the strength in his voice. She looked up at him with something like wonder in her eyes. She had never heard her father speak like this before, in a language that sounded like music, with a confidence that made him seem 10 feet tall. Other customers were watching too, their expressions a mixture of surprise and respect. A few of them nodded slightly. One elderly woman at a corner table smiled. Victoria recovered quickly. Women like her did not become successful by crumbling at the first sign of resistance. Her shock transformed into anger, her pale cheeks flushing red. If she could not attack his intelligence, she would attack everything else. She switched to English, making sure everyone in the café could understand every word. She wanted an audience for what she was about to say. She told Marcus that speaking French did not change anything. She told him to look at himself, at his cheap clothes, his worn-out shoes, his rough carpenter's hands. She said she knew men like him, men who peaked in college, who had a little education and thought that made them special, but who never amounted to anything in the real world. She asked him what he did for a living now. She demanded to know if he really thought speaking a foreign language made him equal to the people in this room. She gestured around at the other customers at their designer clothes and expensive watches. She asked him if he honestly believed he belonged among them. Marcus did not respond immediately. He simply looked at her, his expression calm, but his eyes betraying a deep sadness, not for himself, but for her, for a woman so wrapped up in wealth and status that she had forgotten what truly mattered. Victoria took his silence as weakness and pressed harder. She announced to the room that she owned 5 art galleries in Manhattan. She named the famous artists whose work she displayed, the celebrities who attended her parties, the politicians who sought her favor. She said her annual income was probably more than he would earn in a lifetime. She asked him what he had to offer his daughter, besides empty words and second-hand clothes. David stood nearby, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene against his most valuable customer. He watched the scene unfold with the expression of a man who wished he was anywhere else. A few customers looked away, embarrassed by Victoria's display. Others watched with the morbid fascination of people witnessing a car accident. The cafe felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air growing heavy with tension. Victoria took a step closer to Marcus and lowered her voice, though it was still loud enough for those nearby to hear. She told him that he was embarrassing his daughter by bringing her to a place where they did not belong. She said children knew these things. She said Lily would grow up remembering this moment, remembering how her father had pretended to be something he was not and failed. She said the kindest thing he could do would be to leave now before he damaged his daughter any further. Victoria turned to David and spoke with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. She told him that this man was disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of the cafe and making other customers uncomfortable. She suggested in a tone that was clearly a command that he should be asked to leave. David shifted his weight nervously, looking between Victoria and Marcus. His job depended on keeping customers like her happy. His conscience told him this was wrong. For a long moment, he seemed frozen, unable to decide. Then he took a step toward Marcus. His voice was apologetic, but firm, as he began to suggest that perhaps it would be best if Marcus and his daughter continued their mourning elsewhere. He said there were plenty of other cafes in the neighborhood, perhaps somewhere more suitable for a family outing. He did not finish the sentence because he could not bring himself to say the words, but everyone understood what he meant. Marcus was being asked to leave not because he had done anything wrong, but because he did not look like he belonged. Lily had been watching everything with growing distress. She did not understand all the words, but she understood that the angry woman wanted them to go away. She understood that the man in the vest was telling her daddy to leave. She understood that this special day, the day they were supposed to remember Mommy, had turned into something scary and confusing. Her eyes filled with tears, and she began to cry softly, the way children do when they are trying to be brave, but cannot hold it together anymore. She pulled at her father's hand and spoke through her tears. She told him she wanted to go home. She said she did not want the croissant anymore. She said she was sorry for asking to come here. Her small voice cracked on the last word, and Marcus felt something shatter inside his chest. This was supposed to be a beautiful day. Emily had wanted their daughter to experience this place with wonder and joy. Instead, Lily was crying in front of strangers, apologizing for existing in a space where some people thought she did not belong. Marcus looked down at his daughter. Then around at the cafe, the crystal chandeliers, the marble tables, the well-dressed customers who averted their eyes, the manager who stood waiting for him to leave quietly, Victoria, who watched with cold satisfaction, certain she had won. Everything seemed to be against him. Every face, every silence, every unspoken judgment. He had wanted to keep his promise to Emily. He had wanted to give his daughter one perfect morning. Instead, he had exposed her to cruelty and made her feel ashamed. For a moment, Marcus considered simply walking out, taking Lily's hand, pushing through the door, and never looking back. It would be easier. The confrontation would end. His daughter would stop crying. They could find another cafe, a simpler place, somewhere they would not be judged. He could explain to Lily that sometimes the world was unfair, and the best thing to do was walk away. But even as he thought these things, he knew he could not do it. Walking away now would teach Lily that people like Victoria were right, that money and status determined your worth, that if someone with power told you that you did not belong, you should accept it and leave. Marcus knelt down beside his daughter, bringing himself to her eye level. He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his calloused thumb and looked into her eyes, the same brown eyes that Emily had. He told her that Daddy had made a promise to Mommy, and Daddy always kept his promises. He told her that no one, no matter how rich or how loud, had the right to make her feel like she did not deserve to be somewhere. He asked her to trust him for just a little while longer. Lily sniffled and nodded, her small hand tightening around his fingers. Marcus stood up slowly and turned to face Victoria once more. He was not leaving. Not like this. Marcus stood with his daughter's hand and is facing the room that had judged him unworthy. Victoria watched him with narrowed eyes, waiting for him to accept defeat and walk out the door. David stood nearby, uncomfortable, but committed to the path he had chosen. The other customers remained silent, witnesses to a drama they had not asked for but could not look away from. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor, illuminating the dust particles that floated in the air like tiny witnesses. Marcus thought about Emily. He thought about the last conversation they had in the hospital when she could barely speak above a whisper. She had told him to be strong for Lily. She had told him to teach their daughter that her worth was not determined by what others thought of her. She had told him to keep his promises, no matter how hard it became. He had held her hand and sworn he would. Now, standing in this café where they had once been so happy, he understood what keeping that promise truly meant. It meant staying. It meant showing Lily that dignity could not be taken away by cruel words or cold stars. He looked down at Lily, who was watching him with complete trust. Her tears had stopped, but her cheeks were still wet. She was waiting to see what her father would do. She was waiting to learn, in the way children learn from watching their parents, how to respond when the world treated you unfairly. Marcus realized that this moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. She would remember whether her father had stood tall or walked away. She would carry that memory into every difficult situation she faced. He could not let her remember him as a man who surrendered. Marcus straightened his shoulders and addressed David directly. His voice was calm but firm, as he said that he and his daughter were paying customers who had done nothing wrong. He said they would stay, order their food, and enjoy their morning like anyone else. He said he understood that the cafe valued its wealthy clientele, but he asked David to consider what kind of establishment turned away a father and his young daughter simply because their clothes were not expensive enough. David's face flushed with shame. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a voice cut through the tension from across the room. The voice belonged to an elderly woman sitting at a corner table near the window. She had silver hair pinned up elegantly and wore a simple blue dress with a string of pearls. Her posture was perfect, her expression sharp and intelligent. She had been watching the entire scene unfold, and now she rose from her chair with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect. As she walked toward Marcus, recognition flickered across her face, followed by genuine warmth. She called out his name, Marcus Thompson. She asked if it was really him. Marcus turned toward the voice, and his eyes widened with surprise. He knew this woman. Mrs. Eleanor Lambert had been a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University for over 40 years. She had retired as professor emeritus 5 years ago, but during her tenure, she had been one of the most respected scholars in her field. More importantly to Marcus, she had been his mentor and colleague, one of the few people who had supported him when he first joined the faculty as a young professor. Mrs. Lambert reached Marcus and took both his hands and hers. Her eyes were bright with emotion. As she said, she hardly recognized him at first. She said it had been too long since they had seen each other, and she was so sorry to hear about Emily. She asked about Lily, looking down at the little girl with a grandmother's tenderness. Then she turned to face the room, and her voice carried the authority of decades spent lecturing in crowded halls. She introduced Marcus to the silent café. She told them he had been one of the most brilliant professors in the linguistics department at Columbia University. She told them he had published 3 books on French language and culture, works that were still used as textbooks in universities across the country. She told them he had been invited to teach at the Sorbonne in Paris, an honor reserved for only the most exceptional scholars. She spoke with pride, as if she was introducing a colleague at an academic conference, and the weight of her words settled over the room like a revelation. Victoria's face had gone pale again, but this time, there was something else in her expression, something that looked almost like fear. Mrs. Lambert noticed her standing there and turned to address her directly. She said she recognized Mrs. Ashford from a gallery opening last year. She said they had spoken briefly about art and literature, and Mrs. Ashford had mentioned her favorite book on linguistics. She asked if Victoria remembered the title. It was called The Soul of Language, a beautiful exploration of how words shape human connection. Mrs. Lambert asked Victoria if she remembered who wrote that book. Victoria did not answer. She did not need to. Her face told the story clearly enough. The color drained from her cheeks as she realized the truth. The man she had mocked, the man she had called pathetic and inferior, the man she had tried to humiliate in front of everyone, was the author of the book she had displayed in her gallery and praised at dinner parties. She had told people it was one of her favorite books. She had quoted from it to impress her wealthy friends. And now she stood face to face with its author, wearing her shame like an expensive coat she could not take off. The other customers began to murmur among themselves. The young man in the tailored suit, who had smirked earlier, now looked deeply uncomfortable. The woman in pearls shook her head slowly. An older gentleman near the door spoke up, saying that money clearly could not buy class. A few others nodded in agreement. The tide had turned completely. Victoria, who had entered the café like royalty, now stood alone in a sea of disapproval. David stepped forward, his earlier discomfort transformed into genuine remorse. He apologized to Marcus sincerely, saying he should never have asked him to leave. He offered to serve Marcus and Lily for free, to give them the best table in the house, anything to make up for how they had been treated. His voice cracked slightly, and it was clear he meant every word. Marcus looked at David for a long moment, then shook his head gently. He told David that he appreciated the offer, but they would pay for their meal like any other customer. He said he had not come here for special treatment. He had come here to keep a promise to his wife and to give his daughter a happy memory. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside were a few bills, enough to cover 2 croissants and 2 cups of hot chocolate. He had counted the money before leaving home this morning, making sure he had exactly what he needed. Marcus ordered in French, speaking directly to the young woman behind the counter, who had watched everything in stunned silence. He asked for 2 croissants and 2 hot chocolates, please. The woman nodded quickly and began preparing their order, her hands trembling slightly. Around them, the café slowly returned to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed, cups clinked against saucers, but something had changed in the air. The arrogance that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by something quieter, something that felt almost like respect. Victoria stood frozen near the counter, her Birkin bag hanging from her arm, her Louis Vuitton heels suddenly seeming less impressive. No one looked at her. No one spoke to her. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was invisible. The wealth and status that had always commanded attention now meant nothing. She had revealed herself to be exactly what Marcus had said she was, the poorest person in the room. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, she turned and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, but the sound was lonely now. Empty. She pushed through the glass door and disappeared into the October morning without looking back. Marcus carried their tray to a small table by the window. It was the same table where he and Emily had sat on their first visit to this café years ago, when they were young and poor and completely in love. He helped Lily into her chair and placed a golden croissant on the plate in front of her. She looked at it with wide eyes, then looked up at her father, with a smile that reminded him so much of Emily, it made his heart ache. Clear's throat. Lily took her first bite, and her face lit up with joy. She told her father it was delicious, the best thing she had ever tasted. She said, "Mommy would have loved it." Marcus smiled, his eyes glistening with tears. He did not try to hide. He told her, "Yes, Mommy would have loved it very much." He told her Mommy was watching them right now, and she was so proud of her brave little girl. They sat together in the warm sunlight, a father and daughter sharing croissants and hot chocolate, surrounded by the soft sounds of the café. Outside, autumn leaves drifted past the window in shades of gold and red. Inside, Marcus held his daughter's hand across the table and silently thanked Emily for bringing them here. The promise was kept, the memory was made, and somewhere, Zur, he knew Emily was smiling.